Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. I want to share with you how to dry emboss with your stencils and also a few ways to kick this technique up a notch too. So for this technique, you're going to need stencils. I am using the Crafters Workshop stencils. Thicker, sturdier stencils work best for this technique. You're also going to need a die cut machine and felt. Now the amount of felt you're going to need is going to be different for everyone depending on how much pressure your machine has, how old your machine is, all kinds of things. I'm using 3 layers here of just plain craft felt. You're also going to need cardstock. I'm using heavyweight cardstock. The thicker the cardstock, the better in this case. So what you do is put down your felt, then put your cardstock down, lay your stencil over, and run this through as you would any die cut. Then when you pull it out on the other side, you are left with this beautiful embossed impression on your cardstock. It's really very simple. But what I want to share as I'm die cutting out these little images from Lawn Fawn to finish off my card is that this technique is going to be a little bit different for each and every person. Again, depending on your stencil, depending on your cardstock, depending on your die cut machine, you need to play around with the amount of felt you have in there and the amount of pressure you're putting on your stencil. And that could change, like I said, from stencil to stencil. If you're using a cheaper, thinner stencil, you might need another piece of felt in order to get a really nice impression. You may need to take a piece of felt out if you're using a thicker stencil or just a thicker cardstock. So play around with this technique. The one thing I want to tell you is do not force anything through your die cut machine. If it doesn't want to go, don't do it. It's going to get stuck. It's going to break your die cut machine. You'll feel it with your hands. You'll know what I'm talking about. If it goes through with a little bit of resistance, that's what you want. But you do not want to force this through. Now, moving back to the card, I die cut those images from the Lawn Fawn Year 7 stamp and die set. It's one of their very small ones, but I love the little pinata on this. And I colored those images up with my Prismacolor color pencils and my OMS. I am going to add this little pinata onto that background where I did my embossing. Now for that embossing, I used the Wave stencil from the Crafters Workshop. That is one of their cake and cookie stencils, but I love the pattern on it, so I'm using it in my craft room. One thing I will say about the cake and cookie stencils that I say every time I use them in my craft room, if you want to use them for baking, use them for baking. Keep them in your kitchen. If you want to use them in your craft room, don't take them in there and take them back to your kitchen. If you keep them in the craft room, they stay in the craft room. Now, once I had my little images stamped and colored, I added some foam and also a little black string to my piñata. And the easiest way to get that string to stay, I find, is just to tape it down. I wrap it around to the back as well and tape it onto the back to hold everything in place. That's the easiest way to get it to stay other than using like liquid adhesive or something like that where it takes a little time to dry. So once I had my piñata down, I'm going to go ahead and add this Celebrate die cut onto a flag banner die as well. That's just going to help it pop out and give it a little place to rest as well. I added that flag banner onto the bottom of my die cut oval, and I also added those little stamped candies that I die cut as well, just around the Celebrate die to make it look like the piñata popped open. I'm adding that oval onto a piece of pattern paper. This is from the MFT Sweet Celebrations pattern paper set. I love the bright colors on it. I added everything onto an A2 top folding card base, and that is the first card. Super simple, but that little bit of embossing in the background on that oval die cut really just helps add a lot of interest to this very simple card. It's very subtle, but it's so fun. Now, let's move on to doing this technique again, but this time I'm going to be more precise about where I put my stencil. So I am using this love frame stencil from the Crafters Workshop, and I am placing that heart right down there in the bottom right-hand corner. I am going to go ahead and set up my sandwich again. I'm using my multi-purpose platform, both tabs down, my first cutting plate. Then I'll go ahead and put down my 3 layers of felt. Then I'll lay down my cardstock with my stencil over the top, again, making sure I keep that heart down there in the bottom right-hand corner. I want to use that heart to highlight my sentiment die cut whenever I put this card together. Now, the reason I love the Crafters Workshop for this technique is because they are nice and thick stencils. They have some heft to them, so they hold up to this and they give a really nice impression as you emboss them into your cardstock. Now, the cardstock I'm using is 110 pounds. It's heavyweight, so it gives that really nice deep impression along with these stencils. But there you can see I've got this gorgeous embossed background ready to go onto my card as is if you wanted to, but I want to do a little something to highlight the embossing on this background before I put it on my finished card. Now, the great thing about this technique too, you can use the front or you can use the back depending on which one you like better and what look you're going for. Just another little tip there too. For this background, like I said, I want to highlight that embossing. So I'm going to add some ink blending over the top of this. Now I want this very soft and I just want the bristles to catch around those edges of the embossing. So I'm using my Clarity stencil brushes for this. I'm also using Party Dress ink from Catherine Pooler, which is just a nice blending ink that I love. I'm just going around the edges with my Clarity stencil brush and bringing that color towards the center of the card. I don't want to add a ton of really intense color. I just want to highlight those areas, and ink blending over the top is really going to help that embossing pop out. Now I'm going in a circular motion, leaving the darkest color on the edges and then keeping it lighter towards the center of the card panel. Once I'm happy with it, I can go ahead and move on to my next step. Now I want to keep this super simple, so all I'm going to do for this is add a Hugs die cut for my sentiment. But I just like the look of a layered die cut. I think having that chipboard effect really helps the sentiment pop out and add that little extra interest to a very simple card. So I'm using this Hugs die from Hefty Doodle. I die cut it 3 times from black cardstock. Now I like to use either 3 layers of cardstock or 5. I don't know why. That's just my preference and the looks that I like. If I want it a little bit thicker, I go up to 5. If I want it a little bit thinner, I stick at 3. That's just how many layers I use. I don't know. I'm different. Anyway, I layered up these 3 die cuts with liquid adhesive and then applied them right to that center of the heart that I made sure was in the bottom right-hand corner. I knew I wanted that heart to highlight the sentiment, so I went ahead and made sure that my stencil aligned like that when I set it up to run through my emboss or my die cut machine. I went ahead and matted that panel with some black cardstock and applied the whole panel onto an A2 top folding card base to completely finish this card. Now this last background is my favorite. It's kind of a technique of its own. You're still using the embossing technique, but before we emboss, I want to go ahead and add some ink to the stencil. Now for this, I like the VersaFine Clear ink. It is a pigment ink. It stays wet a little bit longer, but it also does not beat up on your stencil. It sticks to the stencil, it lays nice and flat, and it creates a nice even layer of ink. Some dye inks, when you do this, they're going to beat up on your stencil and it's going to show whenever you press them into the cardstock. So for this, I really like the VersaFine Clear. You can try other pigment inks too and see if they work for you. Even your Distress Oxides might work for this technique. They are more of along a pigment ink line, so they might work for this too. Once I have it completely covered, the area I want of the stencil covered, I'm going to go ahead and tape this down, my cardstock down to the stencil. Now for this, I am using this new tape that I found from Home Depot. I'll leave it linked down below in the description box, but it is a delicate tape, painter's tape from 3M. It's perfect to use for this technique because it holds the cardstock in place, but it doesn't put so much pressure or it doesn't have so much stick that it sticks and rip your cardstock whenever you go to take this off. I also covered up the back of this so the ink didn't transfer to my die cutting plate and then I had a huge mess. Now when this comes out, you're going to have the most gorgeous background that is not only embossed, but those embossed areas, those depressed areas, have the ink in them. It's just gorgeous. It looks like a letterpress plate where you're pressing in the ink with your plate, but in this case, your plate is a stencil. So just another way to use this technique and really kind of up it to the next level. But there you can see that embossing has that nice clean area with that pigment ink. It's just so gorgeous. The ink I used was Summertime too from VersaFine Clear. I don't think I said that. Now to keep this card really all about that background, I'm just going to add a few little die cuts and also a sentiment. The die cuts I'm using are from the feathered stamp set from Concord and Ninth, the stamp and die set. I am going to go ahead and just stamp one of the die cuts with the matching feather from the stamp set, and I'm using that same Summertime ink. That's just going to keep this card a little bit more cohesive and keep the eye moving to that really, really beautiful background. Whenever I'm stamping die cuts like this, I like to go ahead and use the outline in my MISTI, line up the stamp in that outline, then place down my die cut. This is going to allow me to not only get positioning perfect, but it also allows me to double stamp if I want to. In this case, I did, and there I've got a really fun feather die cut that is perfectly stamped without any trouble at all or having to restamp. Once I had that done, I'm going to go ahead and layer up my 3 little feathers with some liquid adhesive, and then I'll pop those up in the bottom left-hand corner of that background with foam adhesive, just adding that little bit of dimension to keep those feathers off the background and add that little bit of shadow. Now, once I had those down, I also stamped a flag banner, but I didn't love the look of it. So I trimmed off one end to where it's just at an angle, and then I'll go ahead and place that down over the feathers and trim off the other end. So I've got this angled banner instead of a flag banner, which I like much better. I used the Happiness is Having You for a Friend sentiment from that Concord 9th feathered stamp set, and I used Pinecone ink from VersaFine Clear. I also matted that panel with some craft cardstock and applied it to a side folding A2 card base that I'm using horizontally to completely finish this card off. That is the card. Super simple. I really wanted to keep, again, the focus on that fun background that has that letterpress look to it. And all I used was my stencils and also some pigment ink. So I've said it before on my channel, stencils are one of my favorite tools in my craft room. First of all, they're not that expensive. Second of all, they are so versatile. I have a whole playlist on my YouTube channel, which I will leave linked down below, and also in the top right hand corner, that just shows all the different ways to use your stencil in your card making. They're so versatile, you really can't run out of techniques to use them with. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. All the links to all the products I used are down below in the description box. Thanks for watching today, and happy crafting, everyone.